Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody is still doing well during this coronavirus pandemic in 2020. Today, we're going to move into the next unit, which is going to be topic 9, and this is going to be all about World War II. We're going to divide this up into several different pieces, several different chunks, and several different videos. So stay tuned, and we're going to work our way through the Second World War. And actually, the place that we're going to start in the Second World War is actually an event that leads us into it. So this is one of the kind of roads to World War II, and it actually starts in Spain. So one of the problems that Spain had been going through in the interwar period was Spain had really been in decline since 1650. Really, the empire was getting lost all through the 1800s, and countries were getting independence, and Spain was really kind of this backward, old-fashioned state that was losing power, to the point where in 1899, if you'll remember, Spain was really embarrassed and humiliated by the United States when they lost the Spanish-American War, during which they lost Puerto Rico, they lost Guam, they lost the Philippine Islands, all to the growing power of the American Empire. Now, in response to that, then, there were major issues. Number one is, of course, class structure. There were a lot of really incredibly poor people in Spain and a very few rich people. And, of course, also one of the things we have to understand is the Catholic Church was really super powerful in Spain. And that caused a lot of people, particularly socialists and communists and anarchists, all of the people who wanted to overthrow the currently existing social structure really had a lot of concern about the way that Spanish society was organized. And so a lot of people attacked the church and its power and its wealth. A lot of people attacked the class structure. Of course, socialists and communists and anarchists in particular attacked the class structure. And then, of course, there was this kind of old-fashioned system of government. And so, in the meantime, King Alfonso XIII decided that he was going to try to increase his own power after World War I, and he was going to try to remove their parliament, which was called the Cortes. In replacement for the Cortes, he appointed a man named Miguel Primo de Rivera to be basically the new prime minister in 1923. However, from 1923 until 1930, Miguel Primo de Rivera was going to rule Spain really as a dictator on behalf of King Alfonso XIII. However, when Miguel Primo de Rivera became more and more popular and powerful, eventually the king felt that he was a challenge to the power of the king. And so ultimately what he did was in 1930, he dismissed Miguel Primo de Rivera and forced him to live in exile in Spain. Now, that would have been a good thing for the king because he would have gotten a lot more power, except for the fact that, of course, in 1930, that's when the Great Depression, was really hitting Europe extremely hard. And so because Miguel Primo de Rivera was no longer around in charge of the government, King Alfonso XIII himself actually personally took a lot of blame for the Great Depression. And as a result of that, in 1931, a constitutional republic overthrew the king and was set up to deal with this new problem of the Great Depression. The king abdicated, and ultimately Manuel Azaña became the leader of a new coalition government. In 1933, new elections brought conservatives to the Cortes, to the legislative branch. Pretty much they did what you would expect them to do. They ignored the lower levels of society and their concerns. They undid a lot of the liberal reforms that had been going on, and a lot of the people who didn't like conservatives, like socialists and communists and anarchists and even some liberals, got to the point where they really didn't like this new conservative government. And so between 1933 and 1936, people on the political left, communists, socialists, anarchists, people of that particular nature, they all decided to unify together into what we call the Popular Front, and they got ready for the new elections in February of 1936. And when they unified all of their forces together, they very narrowly won control of the Spanish government. Now, one of the things they were trying to do, of course, is they were trying to reform Spanish society. They were trying to tax the rich and pay for programs for the poor, and really try to make things, socially progressive in that kind of socialist mindset rather than seeking an active revolution. In response to that, though, because a lot of these members of the Popular Front were communists and were taking orders directly from Moscow. Remember, 1930s, we're talking about Stalin at the height of his power in the Soviet Union. He is sending agents out to try to influence and manipulate other countries around the world. And Spain, of course, is a huge target because if you control Spain, you can control a lot of access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so that gave Stalin a lot of kind of impetus to try to make it into Spain and to have some sort of influence over Spain. Now, people in Spain knew this. They knew that members of their government were more loyal to Stalin than they naturally were to the kind of nationalist pride in Spain itself. Those people, those nationalists in particularly, on the political right, formed together into a new group under Miguel Primo de Rivera's son, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, and they formed a group which was called the Falange Española, or sometimes we just refer to this as the Phalange, which means the phalanx, which maybe some of you guys will remember from ancient Greece and how the Spartans had this unbreakable phalanx where if they all stuck together, their military was indestructible. The Falange Española, or the Falange, became the kind of political catch-all for the political right. And what they basically did is they started to become basically like a fascist organization where they looked at following their supreme leader and extreme nationalism and hatred of communism and an attempt to kind of bring Spain back to the good old days when Spain was this massively powerful empire. However, after the Popular Front won the elections in 1936, in February of 1936, many people in Spain started to worry that Spain was being taken over by this kind of international communist plot. And particularly the people who were most upset by this were members, of course, of the Falange, but also, of course, members of the military. Now, military people generally don't like big change. They don't like people who aren't loyal to their country. They don't like, radical movements coming into power. And an awful lot of these guys, the military was really their way forward and their way up the social ladder. And so they didn't really like the idea of converting their country over to a communist country. One of these people in particular was a general in the Spanish military named Francisco Franco. In July of 1936, a group of generals led by Francisco Franco rebelled against the government of Spain. Now, the thing you have to realize here is Franco is a rebel. He is starting a revolution against his government because he believes that his government is not loyal to the people of Spain or to the nation of Spain. Franco is a nationalist. Okay, he is saying that the government in Madrid is ultimately not loyal to the government, but the government in Madrid is going to say that Franco is not loyal to the government, which is true because he's starting a rebellion. So there's this difference in how they talk about each other. The way we're going to do it is we're going to call Franco's side the nationalist side, and we're going to call the government under the Popular Front, under the communists, under the anarchists, under the socialists in Madrid, we're going to call them the Republicans. Okay. Now, this is how it starts. The rebellion starts in Morocco and in the northwest of the country. And Franco, of course, has the military. And the military versus the regular people, that's not going to go terribly well for the regular people. The government, the Republicans, one of the first things they did is they seized a hold of Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. They put him in jail and they executed him as the leader of the Falange. Then they started to round up other people. And of course, on both sides of this war, what we have to realize is there are horrifically bad atrocities. The Republicans go after what they perceive to be their enemies. So these would be people who are likely to be conservatives. That would be landowners. That would be clergymen. Somewhere around 20% of all of the clergymen, of the priests, of the bishops, of the church officials in Spain are going to be killed during this Spanish Civil War. In total, the Republicans are going to murder about 55,000 or so of their perceived enemies. The nationalists, of course, are going to indiscriminately target civilians. They're going to murder communists. They're going to murder anybody who they believe is loyal to the government of Madrid and to the Soviet Union. The estimates for atrocities on the nationalist side are much closer to about 150,000. So this is not a clean war. This is not, a very kind of good guys versus bad guys war. This is really a brutal and destructive war that actually continues to shape a lot of what's happening in Spain today. By November of 1936, what we see is that the Republicans are basically in a stalemate with these armed civilians and workers being used as guerrilla forces and terrorist forces against their own army. It really breaks down to poor workers and peasants versus landowners, the army, and the Catholic Church. The poor people in Spain's few factories in the big cities, especially in the east, kind of barricaded themselves up inside of those cities, and then they fought as hard as they possibly could against their own army in order to maintain their position in the big cities. But of course, since their government was being led by communists, one of the things they did was they decided to try to build a team to help them, an international team. And so they went to members in the Soviet Union and they said, can we possibly get the workers of the world to unite behind us and to rise up against the capitalists who are holding us down and to join us in this fight? So here we actually see a Republican propaganda poster. The no pasarán there in the top in Spanish means they shall not pass. And we see members of the Spanish Republican forces behind their barricade fighting back against their own military. And back in the background of this poster, what you see is this kind of ghostly figure of people coming from all over the world in what are called the international brigades. These are communists from all over the world that the Soviet Union especially is petitioning and is endorsing to come into Spain to fight on behalf of the Spanish Republic. So of course the Spanish Civil War, it's not just a civil war. When the Soviets start to send in communist forces through the international brigades, this becomes an international war. Now, Franco's no dummy, and of course, when Franco sees that he's fighting more than just his own communist government, he's also fighting these international brigades. He decides that he better get international help too, and so he starts looking around for who's out there and available to provide support for someone who's fighting back against communists. And of course, we should be able to predict who he's going to find that hates communism more than anybody else. Well, of course, the first person he goes to is Adolf Hitler in Germany, who absolutely totally hates communism. And he also goes to Benito Mussolini in Italy, in fascist Italy, and they send him support, they send him soldiers, they send him weapons. For the Germans in particular, this was a really good deal because, of course, they're not supposed to have an air force, they're not supposed to have tanks, they're not supposed to have, certain numbers of machine guns because of the Treaty of Versailles. And so ultimately, this is an attempt or an opportunity for them to basically practice outside of the view of the League of Nations so that they're not openly violating the Treaty of Versailles, but they get a chance to practice for the war that they know is coming. Now, this, of course, leads to the nationalist side making very good progress. And you can see here by October of 1937, a little more than a year into the war, the nationalists are doing well. They're expanding their territory. They've unified the Northwest with Morocco. And of course, they're making some progress. Madrid, of course, is barricaded. The people there are fighting tooth and nail, block by block, to hold the nationalist forces out. But what we've got here really is what we call a proxy war. This is fascism versus communism playing itself out in the Spanish Civil War. Now, another one of those atrocities that we really need to mention because it's really, really super important, and it really shows us why the Spanish Civil War is usually referred to as a warm-up or a practice, or it's the scrimmage before the big game of World War II, because on April the 26th of 1937, a group of German Air Force pilots from the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, on April the 26th of 1937, the Luftwaffe wanted to test one of their new tactics, which they'd never really tried before, and the tactic was called carpet bombing. Now, this is when you line your bombers up in a straight line, you fly over an area, and you just drop bombs from one side to the other, just like laying down carpet. Now, the problem that they've got is they want to test how effective this new tactic is. So they can't really go to Madrid because Madrid's already been blown up and bombed out for over a year. So if you bomb Madrid, you don't really know how much damage your carpet bombing technique used. They had to find a city that wasn't very damaged so that whatever gets damaged, they know that their carpet bombing tactic is responsible for, and that's how they're ultimately going to measure very, very accurately how effective this technique is. What they decide to do, horrifically of course, and this is absolutely horrible, the German Condor Legion decided that they were going to go up to the north. Now on the map that we're looking at here, the town we're talking about is actually just a little bit outside of that city of Pamplona. The city in question is called Guernica. Guernica was a Basque city full of people who are ethnically Basques, and it had basically been an untouched city. There really hadn't been a whole lot of damage done there. On April the 26th of 1937, the German Condor Legions decided that they were going to test their new tactic of carpet bombing on Guernica, and this was horrifically destructive. Not a whole lot of people were killed, but again, this was a town that was basically at peace, and ultimately was targeted just to test the efficiency of this new military tactic. So a horrible, awful, terrible thing to do to civilians who, again, it's a peaceful zone, it's not on the front lines. This was completely and totally unnecessary, but this is what the Germans really wanted to do. Now, one of the interesting consequences of this is Pablo Picasso, who you guys should remember from the previous sections, went out and saw the damage from the Guernica bombings, and one of the things that he decided to do was to paint a painting, which is called Guernica, using his style of cubism and using this kind of, the chaos. He's trying to communicate the chaos and the damage inflicted, and so this is one of his most famous paintings. This actually now hangs in the United Nations building in New York to remind us that, there are real, innocent civilian people out there, and when we take action when it comes to war, we should always try to keep those people in mind, because those are the people who are ultimately going to suffer under this military action. Beyond the atrocities of Guernica, we also see the Republicans, for example. This is a group of nuns who, a riot by anarchists and Republicans, went into a Catholic church and exhumed the bodies of nuns to demonstrate that these nuns had been pregnant, which means that they weren't good nuns. They weren't living up to their religious requirements to stay, chaste and to not get pregnant and things like that. The Republics, did propaganda pieces like this where they staged the execution of the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue. This is a very famous statue and a very important cultural site for Spaniards right outside the city of Madrid. They organized this photograph as a kind of symbolic execution of the old way of doing things, of this kind of super importance of religion. They target clergy. I mean, the Spanish Civil War is an ugly and brutal and horrific thing. By November of 1938, really we know what's going to happen here. The nationalists are making great progress. They're surrounding the cities. They're starving the people out of it. They're going to eventually win this Spanish Civil War, which really they do. Realistically, by the end of 1938, it's pretty much hopeless for the Spanish Republic. A lot of the people who supported the Republic went up into the hills. They became guerrillas. Some of them continued to fight as almost kind of a terrorist group all the way up until the 1940s and 1950s. And Franco, of course, becomes the dictator of now fascist Spain, or Francoist Spain. And one of the things that he does is he says, "I saved Spain from communism, and when Spain is ready, I will give it back its democracy." One of the interesting things is he actually did eventually keep his promise, and in 1979, right before he died, he did produce a new Spanish republic. He did create a new democratic system of government in Spain. What it took to get there was brutal and nasty and horrific, but ultimately this is what Franco said was necessary to save Spain from the horrific stuff going on in the Soviet Union under communism. So this video, of course, is a precursor to World War II. This is the practice run. This is the warm-up. This is the scrimmage before the big event. In the next video, what we're going to see is the actual causes of the First World War and how we follow this road into war to start a full-blown world war in Europe again. So I hope everybody is staying healthy. I hope everybody is staying safe. If you've got any questions, drop a comment, drop a like, subscribe so that you always get the updates to the new lessons that are coming out. out periodically, and I will see you guys in the next video.